was no warning, no press conference, no last-minute negotiation. Canada, the quiet backbone of America's energy empire, shut the valves and walked away. Over $103 billion in oil and gas, gone. Not reduced, not delayed, gone. In the blink of an eye, the lights flickered, the refineries panicked, and fuel prices began to roar like a jet engine in freefall. Washington wasn't just caught off guard, it was caught asleep. You're about to witness how Canada pulled off the most calculated economic betrayal in modern history, and how America never even saw it coming. But is it really a betrayal? Why did Canada choose this moment to strike? What deals did they sign while Washington squabbled? And how will this ripple into your rent, your job, your electricity bill? Stick with me, because this isn't just a crisis. It's the start of a new world order, and no one's ready for it. Washington's mistakes. Washington has always pushed the limits of diplomacy, with increasingly aggressive trade policies. What began as subtle tariff hikes on steel and aluminum grew into a full-blown economic siege. Canadian goods were targeted, dismissed, and penalized under the banner of protecting American industries. Behind closed doors, Canadian diplomats urged caution. They sent letters, made calls, even raised the alarm during summits, but the message never landed. Washington believed geography was leverage. Canada was too close, too dependent, too entrenched in American infrastructure to walk away. That illusion crumbled when the United States doubled down on tariffs, ignoring every red flag. It was a decision born of arrogance, and one that sparked a response far beyond anything American policymakers had imagined. Canada's patience didn't snap in one moment. It eroded over time. The tariffs were just the final blow in a decade-long erosion of trust. When the United States imposed sweeping levies without exemptions, Canada realized the partnership was no longer mutual. It was manipulative. And so, the decision was made. Not out of anger, but calculation. Within weeks of the latest round of tariffs, Canadian officials began finalizing deals with new partners. They weren't bluffing, they weren't threatening, they were leaving. And while Washington fumbled to contain the damage, the most ruthless power moves were already underway, not just by Canada, but by nations and investors around the globe. If you're ready to see how far this crisis spiraled and how it could affect you, make sure to subscribe. It only takes a sec. The real reason Canada made the move. It's not what you think. This wasn't just revenge. It was a strategic masterstroke. Behind the scenes, Canada had been preparing for this moment for years. It had nothing to do with emotion, and everything to do with independence. For too long, the Canadian economy was chained to decisions made in Washington. A change in tariffs, a shift in administration, even a passing comment from an American president could send shockwaves across Canadian markets. That vulnerability wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. So quietly, Canada began building a parallel future. Massive liquefied natural gas terminals were constructed along its western coast. Eastern provinces modernized export ports to handle bulk shipments to Europe. Trade delegations were sent to India, China, and South Korea. Deals were drafted that bypassed North America entirely. And when the time came to walk away from the United States, the infrastructure was already in place. Even domestically, the shift was cultural. Canadian voters began to demand policies that favored diversification over dependence. Local governments launched Buy Canadian campaigns. Provincial leaders froze infrastructure contracts with American firms and rewrote procurement rules. And with the rise of new leadership in Ottawa, the shift accelerated. Mark Carney, once an economist, now a political force, declared energy independence not as a hope, but as a national imperative. From the outside, it looked like retaliation, but from within Canada, it was seen as liberation. And for the United States, it was only just beginning to understand what it had lost. The immediate fallout. Gas prices didn't just rise, they exploded. The economic fallout began within days of the shutdown. American refineries, which had long relied on Canadian crude designed specifically for their processing systems, were forced to source lower quality, higher cost oil from unstable markets. Prices surged. Retail gas stations across the country reported spikes of more than $1 per gallon. Diesel costs soared, hitting logistics companies and freight operators hardest. But it wasn't just the pumps. Airlines faced a jet fuel shortage that sent flight prices climbing. Airports in Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles announced emergency surcharge adjustments. The trucking industry began laying off drivers as diesel crossed unaffordable thresholds. The ripple effect hit retailers, grocery stores, and small businesses. Shipping delays turned into empty shelves. Consumers felt the pressure not just in transportation, but in every corner of their daily lives. Then came Wall Street. Energy stocks swung wildly. Manufacturing shares dropped. Investors scrambled to adjust portfolios. But the damage was swift. American corporations that depended on stable fuel pricing saw margins collapse. Earnings projections were revised downward, triggering a confidence crisis across the financial sector. Indexes dipped. Analysts warned of broader instability. Even the supply chain buckled under pressure. Refineries weren't just short on oil, they were short on the right kind. American infrastructure wasn't built to process Venezuelan crude or Middle Eastern blends at scale. Retrofitting would take years, not months. In the meantime, energy scarcity spread across sectors. Washington was stunned. What was once seen as a secure, friendly supply had turned into a gaping hole in the heart of the economy, and no one, not the president, not the Department of Energy, not the trade representatives, had a clear solution. But the worst wasn't over. Because while Washington scrambled to respond to the domestic crisis, Canada was about to launch its next move, and it would leave the United States even more isolated than before. The White House in crisis. No good options left. What do you do when your entire economy depends on a country that just walked away? The answer, at least for the United States, is to panic. And that is exactly what happened behind closed doors in Washington as the news broke. Canada had cut off its energy exports, over $103 billion worth, leaving the White House stunned, exposed, and dangerously unprepared. Within hours, emergency meetings were called. Cabinet officials, trade advisors, and national security teams flooded into briefing rooms as energy executives sounded alarms louder than anything heard in decades. There was no backup plan, no replacement supplier waiting in the wings, just a scramble to contain an unfolding disaster that was entirely of Washington's own making. Inside the Oval Office, President Donald Trump faced his most humiliating crisis yet. For years, his administration had leaned into aggressive trade measures, including steep tariffs on Canadian goods. The belief was that Canada had no choice but to continue selling energy to the United States. That assumption had collapsed, and now so was America's energy stability. From Capitol Hill to the Pentagon, panic spread like wildfire. But the chaos was not just about the energy itself, it was about what the decision represented. A tectonic shift in power. Canada, once seen as a passive supplier, had seized the upper hand, and Washington was left playing defense. Members of Congress clashed openly. Some demanded the immediate repeal of all tariffs on Canadian imports, arguing that the relationship could still be salvaged. Others doubled down, insisting that Canada's betrayal proved the need for complete American energy independence, even if that meant opening up protected lands for drilling or lifting environmental safeguards. Energy lobbyists flooded lawmakers with proposals, some advocating for a return to Canadian negotiations, others pushing for high-risk alternatives like importing from Venezuela or the Middle East. Every proposal had one thing in common: none could fix the problem fast enough. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans were already feeling the pressure. Gas prices had begun to spike, and economic forecasts painted a grim picture. And while Washington tore itself apart, Canada moved with precision. Canada's master plan. This was not a knee-jerk reaction or some heated response to political slights. It was a deliberate strategy, years in the making. While American officials argued and underestimated, Canadian energy leaders were signing billion-dollar contracts with global buyers. The shift had begun long before the final straw was thrown by Washington's tariffs. It just took one misstep for Canada to put the entire plan into motion. The world's two fastest-growing energy markets, India and China, became Canada's new focus. With vast populations and explosive industrial growth, these nations represented not only energy demand, but long-term leverage. Canadian trade delegations worked tirelessly, forging partnerships that would guarantee energy flows for decades. These were not temporary deals. They were strategic alignments with legal, financial, and logistical frameworks designed to make sure that Canadian oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric power would bypass the United States entirely. At the same time, Europe, still reeling from its reliance on Russian energy, was desperate for a stable partner. Canada stepped in, offering what the European Union needed most: security and predictability. Multinational infrastructure projects were approved, including new liquefied natural gas terminals on both sides of the Atlantic. Pipelines that once fed the American Midwest were now being retooled to serve ports with direct routes to Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Marseille. Internally, Canada unified around the shift. The government, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, poured resources into fast-tracking export infrastructure, streamlining permitting processes, and eliminating bureaucratic delays. Energy firms received subsidies to scale up production for foreign markets. New trade policies removed roadblocks for overseas investment. And while Washington debated how to react, Canada had already sealed its place as a global energy leader. But the shock to the United States was only just beginning, because its oldest allies were about to walk away too. Why America's allies betrayed it too. When the United States looked for help, no one answered. The assumption in Washington was that its global alliances would serve as a safety net. If Canada walked away, Europe or Asia would step in. That assumption proved to be as misguided as the one about Canada's loyalty. Because when the United States reached out to its allies for emergency energy support, they were already in talks with Canada. The European Union, still navigating its post-Russia energy crisis, had quietly moved toward Canadian imports months earlier. French and German leaders, facing political pressure at home over rising energy costs, had accelerated trade deals that would bring Canadian natural gas into the European grid. Scandinavian countries, long proponents of hydroelectric stability, locked in long-term agreements with Canadian power firms to avoid reliance on Russian or Middle Eastern sources. Even in Asia, where American influence once loomed large, traditional partners had pivoted. South Korea, Japan, and India, all longtime strategic allies, were prioritizing Canadian contracts. The logic was simple. Canada was more stable, more consistent, and far less politically erratic than the United States under a protectionist trade regime. Diplomatically, the United States began to feel the chill. Meetings that once ended with public statements of unity now ended with silence or polite deflection. Behind closed doors, foreign leaders were blunt. America's unreliability had become too costly. Canada's move had exposed a deep vulnerability in the American system, and its allies no longer wanted to be caught in the fallout. Back in Washington, foreign policy officials were stunned. What had once been a shared energy strategy among Western democracies had splintered into a patchwork of bilateral deals that excluded the United States. The world had moved on, and now the United States faced a crisis without allies and without leverage. And with the clock ticking, the White House was forced to confront a terrifying reality. There were only 3 paths forward, and none of them were good. The 3 poisoned choices. America's impossible dilemma. The United States has 3 ways out, and each one is worse than the last. The first path is obvious: repair the relationship with Canada. But that road is lined with humiliation. Washington would need to repeal tariffs, issue public apologies, and possibly offer economic incentives just to restart the conversation. And even then, Canada might not bite. The deals it signed with Europe and Asia are binding, profitable, and politically popular. To return to the United States would mean risking its new role as a global energy superpower. The second option is to go all in on domestic energy. The United States has the reserves in Texas, North Dakota, and the Gulf of Mexico. But that route requires years of investment, deregulation, and political unity the country no longer has. Environmental groups would resist. Investors remain wary, and no matter how fast production ramps up, it cannot replace Canada overnight. American refineries are built for the kind of crude oil Canada supplied. Switching sources would require retrofitting, delays, and billions of dollars. The third path is the most dangerous. Look elsewhere. Venezuela holds massive reserves, but remains mired in sanctions and political instability. The Middle East is a historic supplier, but comes with volatility, conflict, and geopolitical risk. Russia is off the table. Africa's infrastructure is still developing, and China, already locking up global supply. Each choice carries massive trade-offs. None offer a short-term fix. And with every passing day, the energy crisis grows deeper, the political fallout grows nastier, and the social unrest grows louder. But Washington's nightmare was far from over, because while the global stage shifted and political deals collapsed, the real pain was about to hit home. The industrial collapse begins. When the lights go out in Detroit, America's economic engine dies. And this time, it wasn't a recession, a labor strike, or even a foreign war that flipped the switch. It was Canada. The energy lifeline that kept American factories humming has vanished overnight. And now the assembly lines are grinding to a halt. Automakers in Michigan and Ohio, steel mills in Pennsylvania, and technology manufacturers across the Midwest are all facing a crisis they never anticipated. For decades, their business models depended on one unshakable reality: cheap, stable Canadian energy. That reality shattered the moment Canada walked away. Production costs have exploded. Factories that once ran 24 hours a day are now slashing shifts, shutting down machines, and laying off thousands of workers. In Detroit, auto executives are holding emergency meetings, warning that without affordable energy, they may have no choice but to outsource production overseas. Steel plants that powered America's skyscrapers and bridges are preparing to idle their furnaces. In Silicon Valley, chip manufacturers are delaying expansions, citing surging utility costs and unstable electricity grids. But the damage isn't limited to the factory floor. Entire communities built around these industries are crumbling. Small businesses that rely on factory workers' paychecks, from diners to hardware stores, are watching their customer base disappear. Towns that once thrived on American industry are facing a new reality: economic extinction. And while the factories went dark, the pain for American families was just beginning. The cost of survival. This crisis isn't just about factories and refineries. It's about your paycheck, your grocery bill, and your ability to keep the lights on. The collapse of the Canadian energy supply has unleashed a tidal wave of inflation that is drowning the American middle class. Gas prices have skyrocketed. The average American family is now spending hundreds of dollars more per month just to commute to work, heat their homes, and keep the fridge stocked. Airline tickets are soaring, making family vacations and business travel unaffordable for millions. Utility bills are doubling in cities from New York to Los Angeles. Rolling blackouts are becoming a grim new normal in states that once took affordable power for granted. And when the power goes out, so do the jobs, the schools, and the hospitals. The ripple effect is brutal. Groceries cost more because transportation costs are out of control. Home prices are climbing because construction costs have exploded. And every dollar spent on energy is a dollar not spent on the local economy. Families who were already living paycheck to paycheck are now facing impossible choices: pay the electricity bill or buy groceries, fill up the gas tank or make the mortgage payment. America's middle class, the backbone of the nation, is breaking under the weight of this energy crisis. But while American families struggled to survive, something even more seismic was happening just across the northern border. Canada unleashes a political earthquake. One election north of the border just shattered U.S. influence forever. While Washington was distracted by its own economic chaos, Canada quietly staged a political revolution that rewrote the rules of North American power. The election of Mark Carney as Canada's new Prime Minister was not just a change in leadership, it was a declaration of economic independence. Carney ran on a platform of decoupling Canada's economy from American influence, and he wasted no time delivering on that promise. Canada immediately expanded its trade agreements with Europe and Asia, cutting American companies out of billion-dollar deals. Canadian provinces launched campaigns to eliminate American products from public institutions, freezing contracts, raising tariffs, and even banning certain U.S. goods altogether. But the real shock came from Canadian citizens themselves. What started as political strategy quickly evolved into a social movement. Across the country, public events became anti-American rallies. U.S. brands disappeared from grocery stores, government agencies, and school cafeterias. For the first time in modern history, Canada wasn't just a trading partner, it was leading a full-scale economic and cultural revolt against the United States. And just when it seemed like the damage couldn't get any worse, the real storm was only beginning. Because what happened next didn't just shake Washington, it shook the entire world. But I explain how. Make sure you are subscribed right now in order not to miss videos like this. Anti-Americanism goes mainstream. The United States lost more than oil. It lost the world's respect. Canada's decisive break from American energy dependence set off a chain reaction that no one in Washington anticipated. Around the globe, countries that once followed America's lead began looking elsewhere. European allies, frustrated by years of trade wars and political tensions, inked new energy deals with Canada, bypassing the United States entirely. In Asia, China and India doubled down on long-term agreements with Canadian energy producers, further isolating Washington. But it wasn't just about trade. A cultural backlash was brewing. American brands faced boycotts not just in Canada, but in Europe, Australia, and beyond. The U.S. flag was turned away at public events. American products vanished from store shelves. Nations that once built their economies around American markets were now building walls to keep them out. Diplomatic alliances began to fracture. Longtime partners questioned whether the United States could still be trusted as a stable economic force. And as global power shifted northward, America found itself more isolated than ever. But the real question was no longer whether America could fix this. The question was how much damage had already been done. The labor revolt. When the factories closed, the workers didn't stay quiet. Across the United States, assembly lines ground to a halt as the lifeblood of industry, energy, became scarce and prohibitively expensive. In Detroit, auto plants stood silent. In Pittsburgh, steel mills cooled. And in the heartland, machinery lay idle. The abrupt cessation of Canadian oil exports had sent shockwaves through the economy, leaving millions unemployed and communities on the brink. But American workers are not known for passive endurance. From the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt, a groundswell of dissent erupted. Mass protests filled city streets, with workers demanding immediate action from a government they felt had failed them. Union leaders, once fragmented, united under a common cause: to restore energy stability and protect American livelihoods. Strikes became commonplace, not just in manufacturing but across sectors reliant on affordable energy. Dock workers refused to unload shipments, truckers parked their rigs, and teachers walked out in solidarity. The message was clear: the nation could not function without its workforce, and the workforce demanded change. Political backlash was swift and unrelenting. Lawmakers faced mounting pressure to address the crisis, leading to heated debates and hastily drafted legislation. Some proposed re-engaging with Canada through diplomatic channels, while others pushed for aggressive investment in domestic energy production. Amidst the turmoil, one thing was evident: the status quo was untenable. As the clamor for solutions intensified, another global power was quietly maneuvering to capitalize on America's misfortune. How Beijing profited from America's collapse. While Washington burned, China bought the ashes. In the corridors of Beijing, strategists observed the unfolding American crisis with calculated interest. The void left by the severed Canada-US energy partnership presented an unprecedented opportunity, one that China was poised to exploit. Chinese energy conglomerates swiftly moved to fill the gap, negotiating favorable deals with Canadian producers eager to find new markets. Long-term contracts were signed, ensuring a steady flow of oil and natural gas to fuel China's burgeoning economy. The newly expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline, once a symbol of North American energy integration, now funneled resources eastward across the Pacific. But China's ambitions extended beyond mere acquisition. By securing a dominant position in global energy markets, Beijing aimed to reshape the geopolitical landscape. Control over energy resources translated to influence, a leverage that could be wielded in trade negotiations, diplomatic engagements, and strategic alliances. The ripple effects were felt worldwide. Traditional U.S. allies, witnessing the shift in power dynamics, began recalibrating their foreign policies. Economic partnerships once taken for granted were now in flux, as nations sought to align with the emerging energy hegemon. As China's ascendancy disrupted global equilibria, the financial heart of America began to tremble under the weight of uncertainty. How the markets turned on Washington. Investors didn't wait, they jumped ship. The energy crisis sent shockwaves through financial markets, eroding confidence in the stability of American investments. Stock indices plummeted as portfolios hemorrhaged value. Energy companies, once stalwarts of Wall Street, saw their valuations nosedive, dragging down the broader market with them. Pension funds, heavily invested in energy and manufacturing sectors, faced unprecedented shortfalls. Retirees and those nearing retirement watched in despair as their nest eggs dwindled, prompting a surge in financial insecurity among the populace. Investor panic was palpable. Capital flight became rampant, with funds flowing out of U.S. markets in search of safer harbors. Emerging markets, particularly those aligned with energy-rich nations, experienced influxes of investment, further exacerbating the capital drain from American shores. The federal government scrambled to stem the tide. Emergency measures were enacted to stabilize markets, including interest rate adjustments and stimulus packages. However, these interventions provided only temporary respite, as underlying structural vulnerabilities remained unaddressed. Amidst the financial turmoil, a more profound realization dawned upon the global community. The era of American energy dominance had drawn to a close. The end of American energy power. What this means for the world. This wasn't just about oil. It was about global power. The cessation of Canadian energy exports to the United States marked a pivotal turning point in international relations. The unipolar world, long underpinned by American energy supremacy, gave way to a multipolar reality where power was more diffusely distributed. Nations previously reliant on U.S. energy influence began diversifying their alliances and supply chains. Energy independence became a paramount objective, leading to significant investments in alternative sources and technologies. The geopolitical chessboard was rearranged, with new alliances forming and old ones dissolving. For the United States, the path forward was fraught with challenges. Rebuilding domestic energy infrastructure required time, capital, and political will. Restoring international credibility demanded diplomatic finesse and a departure from isolationist tendencies. Yet, amidst the adversity, there lay an opportunity for introspection and reinvention. The crisis underscored the perils of complacency and the necessity for adaptability in an ever-evolving global landscape. And now, America is left asking one question: how did we let it get this bad? Tell us your thoughts. Let's talk down in the comments, and thanks for watching.